I'll give you my entire month's salary if you can translate this sentence." The icy challenge echoed through the 90th floor boardroom, stunning everyone into silence. No one expected the person who responded wouldn't be a PhD or a lawyer, but a waitress. And just a few minutes later, her words forced the powerful CEO to sign the check in stunned silence. Can you guess what statement she made that caused the arrogant CEO to bow his head? Read until the end, because the secret behind that paper will keep you glued to the page. The atmosphere in the 90th floor boardroom of the Vance Corp building was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Outside, the city of Chicago stretched out, glittering under the nightlights, a magnificent view that no one in the room had the presence of mind to enjoy. 12 people, including top linguists and senior attorneys, sat rigidly around the long mahogany table. All of them avoided the gaze of the man at the head of the table, Alexander Vance. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. His icy blue eyes were fixed on the tattered document lying in the center of the table. The yellowed parchment pages were covered in a strange, sprawling handwriting. It was a will, or more accurately, the final instructions of his eccentric tycoon grandfather, who had died 10 years earlier. And according to the board's stipulation, if the secret within the document wasn't deciphered in the next 48 hours, Alexander would lose his voting rights over the family trust, which constituted 30% of the company's shares. One of the experts, Dr. Albright, who was paid $2,000 an hour, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Vance, as we've explained, this Isadialectofold Occitan, very rare. It doesn't follow standard grammatical rules. We need more time, perhaps a few weeks." "A few weeks?" Alexander's voice cut through the air, not loud but razor-sharp. "I don't have a few weeks. I have 47 hours and 13 minutes. He stood up, the lines off his expensive Tomford suit-tie tenning with his movement. He said around the table, each step on the marble floor, creating a chill ling sound. The invisible pressure made everyone halt air breath. They were the best minds in their fields, but in front of Alexander, they were merely employees who had failed their assignment. 5 experts, he said, his voice even but laced with contempt. 2 PhDs in linguistics, a historian, and 2 lawyers fluent in 4 languages. You've all sat there all day, drinking my coffee, breathing my air, and the only answer is, we need more time. He stopped behind Albright. The elderly doctor could feel the cold rapier ting from his boss. Useless, Alexander snarled. He turned to the head of the table, his anger no longer contained. He grabbed the documents and slammed them on to the center of the table. The thin, ancient pages fluttered wildly. Incompetent fools, Therage finally exploded. I will pay my a monthly salary. 2,000 an hour, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Mr. Vance, as we've explained, this is a dialect of Old Occitan, very rare. It doesn't follow standard grammatical rules. We need more time, perhaps a few weeks. A few weeks? Alexander's voice cut through the air, not loud, but razor-sharp. I don't have a few weeks. I have 47 hours and 13 minutes. He stood up, the lines of his expensive Tom Ford suit tightening with his movement. He paced around the table, each step on the marble floor, creating a chilling sound. The invisible pressure made everyone hold their breath. They were the best minds in their fields, but in front of Alexander, they were merely employees who had failed their assignment. 5 experts, he said, his voice even but laced with contempt. 2 PhDs in linguistics, a historian, and 2 lawyers fluent in 4 languages. You've all sat here all day, drinking my coffee, breathing my air, and the only answer is, we need more time. He stopped behind Albright. The elderly doctor could feel the cold radiating from his boss. Useless, Alexander snarled. He returned to the head of the table, his anger no longer contained. He grabbed the documents and slammed them onto the center of the table. The thin, ancient pages fluttered wildly. Incompetent fools! The rage finally exploded. I will pay my entire monthly salary, $2,000 an hour, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Mr. Vance, as we've explained, this is a dialectofold Occitan, very rare. It doesn't follow standard grammatical rules. We need more time. Perhaps a few weeks. A few weeks. Alexander's voice cut through the air, not loud, but razor-sharp. I don't have a few weeks. I have 47 hours and 13 minutes. Hast du dup? The lines off his expensive Tom Ford sitach teeming with his movement. Hepper said around the table, each step on the marble floor creating actual ling sound. The invisible pressure made everyone hold hairbreadth. They were the best minds in their fields, but in front of Alexander, they were merely employees who had failed our assignment. 5 experts, he said, his voice even but laced with contempt. 2 PhDs in linguistics, a historian, and 2 lawyers fluent in 4 languages. You've all sat there all day, drinking my coffee, breathing my air, and the only answer is, we need more time. He stopped behind Albright. The elderly doctor could feel the cold rapier ting from his boss. Useless. Alexander snarled. He turned to the head of the table, his anger no longer contained. He grabbed the documents and slammed them on to the center of the table. The thin, ancient pages fluttered wildly. Incompetent fools. Therage finally exploded. I will pay my entire monthly salary, $150,000 to anyone, and I mean anyone in this building, who can read this right now. The arrogant declaration hung in the air. The experts exchanged glances, embarrassed and astonished. The lawyers murmured about the young CEO's impulsiveness. It was a desperate gamble of a powerful man cornered. And then, in the suffocating silence, another sound emerged. Squeak. Squeak. It was the soft scrape of worn rubber soles on the tile floor. From the dimly lit corner near the bar, where the light reflected off a glass of wine, a waitress pushed her cart out. Her white apron had a few coffee streaks, her brown hair was tied neatly back, and her eyes were tired but focused. She moved quietly, expertly navigating the uncollected chairs, as if she were well accustomed to being an invisible fixture at the rich people's party. For the past 6 months, she had worked here, serving, cleaning, smiling at the right times. But tonight, the party seemed unwilling to end. The guests were still talking and laughing, and she felt more strongly than ever that something was about to happen. Ilara Reed had only intended to quietly wipe up the last stains in the corner and leave. She had heard everything, but those matters belonged to another world. Her world was the smell of disinfectant, the looming rent payment, and the soft whir of her son's therapy machine. But when the documents were thrown, a page slid out and landed near her feet. She bent down to pick it up, intending to place it back on the table silently. But then her eyes skimmed the lines of script, and she froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her chest. It wasn't standard Occitan. It was the Limousin dialect, a nearly extinct variation recognized by only a handful of scholars worldwide. It was the subject of the doctoral dissertation she had been forced to abandon 5 years ago. A familiar, painful feeling rose within her. It was her old self. A scholar, a researcher, a person who lived and breathed language, a person buried under the weight of life. $150,000. That amount could change everything. It could pay off the hospital debt. It could ensure the best therapy for Leo for years to come. It meant dignity. She straightened up. The entire room turned to look at her, surprised by the presence of a person they had never truly seen before. Alexander Vance's gaze swept over her, cold and impatient, as if she were merely a piece of misplaced furniture. Ilara walked toward the conference table. Her old sneakers made no sound on the marble floor. She placed the page she had just picked up on the table. Her hands, calloused from work, trembled slightly. She took a deep breath, lifted her head, and faced the powerful CEO directly. Her voice rang out, clear and calm, cutting through the strained silence. "Mr. Vance," she said, "is that offer legally binding?" Ilara's question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected as a shard of glass. 12 pairs of eyes in the room simultaneously turned to her, then scrutinized Alexander Vance. They were waiting for the lion's reaction. Alexander narrowed his eyes. A sneer, almost imperceptible, tugged at one corner of his mouth. It was the smile he reserved for fools, or those who dared to challenge him. This waitress, clearly, belonged to both categories. "Are you joking?" He let out a dry laugh. He didn't even bother to look at her, turning instead to the head of his security detail standing by the door. "Mark, escort her out." The man named Mark nodded and began to move toward Ilara. Things were supposed to end here. The waitress would be dismissed, and the room would return to its desperate silence. But Ilara didn't move. Instead of backing away, she stepped forward. Ignoring the approaching bodyguard, she bent down and picked up the nearest page of parchment. The whole room held its breath. "Mark, stop," Alexander commanded. His voice still held a hint of condescension, but there was a flicker of curiosity. He wanted to see how far this farce would go. Ilara held the page with both hands. Her eyes quickly scanned the ancient script, not with the confusion of an amateur, but with the focus of an expert. Then she cleared her throat and began to read. She didn't read in Old Occitan. She translated directly into English. Her voice was steady and clear, without a hint of hesitation. "Where the sun never sets on gold," she began, "seek the key that bears the mark of the falcon. Its number is 6, then 3, then an endless loop." Alexander froze. He slowly sat down in his chair, his hands clenched on the table. That was the exact motto engraved on his grandfather's signet ring. Ilara continued, her voice an anchor of stability amid the chaos. "That key does not unlock a door, but a thought. In Zurich, beneath the Lion's Mountain, Credit Suisse preserves a legacy. Safe deposit box number 729. The password is not a word, but the answer to the question, where does the lion roar?" Dr. Albright's jaw dropped, his face turning pale. He and his team had spent all day just identifying the language, yet this woman was translating it as if reading a news report. "The answer is, where the griffin sleeps soundly," Ilara finished, gently placing the page on the table. She looked up, meeting Alexander's gaze. "That is what is written on this page. I assume the remaining pages will provide further details." The room was dead silent. This time, the silence was not tense, but one of absolute stupefaction. Alexander wasn't shocked by the document's content. He always knew his grandfather had secrets. But he was shocked by the person who had just deciphered it. This woman, in a drab uniform and calloused hands, had exhibited a poise and precision that his highly paid experts could not muster. She didn't just read, she understood. Finally, Alexander found his voice. It was hoarse, stripped of all arrogance. "Who are you?" Ilara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I am the one who finished translating your document." That simple answer was like a slap to Alexander's ego. He blinked, trying to regain control of the situation. His CEO instincts kicked in. He had to revert this unusual event back into a normal transaction. He reached for the crocodile leather wallet in his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a stack of crisp $50 bills, quickly counted 5, and pushed them toward her. "Here, $500, he said, his usual cold demeanor returning. "Thank you for your assistance." He was reducing her back to a servant, a recipient of a gratuity. He was trying to erase the brief moment of power she had just seized, but Ilara didn't even glance at the money. Her eyes remained fixed on Alexander, calm and resolute. "I don't need a tip, Mr. Vance." She spoke, her voice quiet, but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. She glanced around the table, where 12 witnesses still sat motionless. "You made a public offer," she emphasized every word, "in front of everyone. $150,000. The air in the room froze once again. This was no longer a request. It was a demand. A demand based on his own words. The lawyers began to exchange worried looks. They knew that, legally, she was completely correct. A public offer made and accepted by the act of completing the request formed a valid verbal contract. Alexander's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Challenged, cornered by a waitress in his own boardroom, he wanted to roar, to call security to throw her out. But he couldn't. He saw the fleeting glimpse of smugness in the eyes of his rivals on the board. He had dug his own grave with his arrogance. Without a word, he yanked his leather briefcase, pulling out a checkbook. The scratch of his Mont Blanc pen as he signed echoed in the absolute silence. His handwriting pressed deep into the paper, as if he were trying to vent all his fury onto it. He tore the check from the stub, a decisive, angry sound. He didn't hand it to her. He pushed it across the glossy table. Ilara stepped forward and picked up the check. She quickly glanced at the amount, folded it carefully into quarters, and tucked it into the pocket of her worn uniform pants. She nodded politely, as if she had just concluded a normal business transaction. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Now, if that is all, I need to complete my work." With that, she turned, walking toward the cleaning cart, abandoned in the corner. She grasped the handle, and the familiar squeak-squeak of the wheels sounded as she pushed it out of the boardroom. The heavy wooden door closed behind her, leaving Alexander Vance sitting in silent humiliation, and a room full of brilliant minds who had just been outdone by a floor cleaner. The heavy oak door closed, cutting off the squeak-squeak of the cleaning cart, and leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Alexander Vance sat motionless, his eyes glued to the empty space where Ilara Reid had stood. The check stub lay isolated in his checkbook, a $150,000 testament to his own stupidity. The initial rage had dissipated, giving way to another, much stranger and more unsettling feeling: bewilderment. He didn't think about the money. To him, it was just a number. What haunted him was the final image before she turned away. Those eyes, they held no triumph or gloating. They held only a nearly detached calmness, as if she had just completed a chore, nothing more. A woman who had just received a life-changing sum of money showed no emotion whatsoever. "Get out," Alexander said, his voice husky. "All of you." No one dared to argue. Chairs scraped back, papers were gathered in silence. The room quickly emptied, leaving only Alexander, and the scent of expensive cologne mingled with the faint, lingering smell of antiseptic that Ilara had left behind. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the city. Millions of lights, millions of lives. And among them, a floor cleaner had just deciphered a secret that the best minds had failed to crack. The issue wasn't that she could do it, but how she did it. That confidence was not the luck of a novice. It was the certainty of a profound expert. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Julian," he said as soon as the line connected. Julian was Vance Corp's head of security and internal investigation, a discreet and extremely effective man. "Mr. Vance?" "The waitress just left the 90th floor boardroom. Her name is Ilara Reid. I want to know everything about her." "Everything." "Everything?" Julian asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Don't make me repeat myself, Julian. I want her file on my desk before dawn." Alexander hung up, the discomfort still churning in his chest. He hated surprises. He hated uncontrollable variables, and Ilara Reid was the biggest variable he'd ever encountered. 3 hours later, an encrypted email arrived on Alexander's computer. He opened it, expecting a detailed biography, but what he received was disappointing. Ilara Reid, 28 years old. Address: a rented apartment in the Pilsen neighborhood. Work history: 6 months at Vance Corporation. Before that, a series of temporary jobs: warehouse worker, cleaner at a school, kitchen helper at a diner. Nothing remarkable. Education: high school diploma. Family: single, with a 6-year-old son, Leo. Her file was suspiciously blank, as if her life had only truly begun 5 years ago with manual labor jobs. Nothing to explain her extraordinary linguistic ability. Alexander frowned. He typed a reply email to Julian. Not enough. Dig deeper. Cross-reference her name with academic records, research programs, anything. No one spontaneously knows the Limousin dialect. He waited. Time passed, and the city outside gradually quieted down. Finally, at 4 a.m., a second email arrived. This time, it contained a single attachment. He opened the file. It was an academic paper published 6 years ago in the Journal of Historical Linguistics. The article's title was Phonological Decline and Transformation in 12th Century Limousin Dialect. Author: E. Reid. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He continued reading Julian's report. E. Reid, full name Ilara Reid, had been a phenomenon at Yale University. Graduated valedictorian with the highest honors. Received the school's most prestigious full-ride research fellowship. Her doctoral dissertation on Old Occitan was considered a groundbreaking work. Her professors had predicted she would become one of the leading scholars of her generation. And then, 5 years ago, just before defending her dissertation, she abruptly withdrew from the program and vanished from academia. No explanation, no trace, as if she had evaporated from the face of the earth. Alexander leaned back in his chair, a wave of dizziness washing over him. His floor cleaner, the woman he had tossed a $500 tip to. She was E. Reid. A single question spun in his head, growing larger and overshadowing all other thoughts. Why? Why would a genius, a shining star of the academic world, throw it all away to clean floors? Instinctively, he opened the building's security camera system. He rewound the footage of the night. He saw Ilara pushing her cart down the hallway, stopping near the marketing department's shared workspace. Most employees had gone home, but a few working late were clearing their desks. And then he saw it. A young employee, after tidying up, tossed a paperback book into the trash can. It was an old novel. After they left, Ilara pushed her cart near the trash. She looked around, ensuring no one was watching, then bent down and retrieved the book. She didn't put it in her trash bag. Instead, she used a clean rag from her apron pocket to carefully wipe a coffee stain from the cover. She smoothed out the dog-eared pages, then gently placed the book into her old handbag, next to her lunchbox. Alexander zoomed in on the image. He could see the reverence in her every gesture. It was not the action of a petty thief. It was the action of a booksaver. He turned off the monitor, but the image remained imprinted in his mind, a genius picking up the knowledge that others discarded. The mystery of Ilara Reid had become both deeper and more heartbreaking than he had imagined. And for the first time in years, Alexander Vance felt that he truly knew nothing at all. Alexander couldn't sleep. The image of Ilara carefully cleaning a discarded old book kept replaying in his mind. It didn't fit. Everything about her was a contradiction. A genius mind cleaning up other people's trash. A woman who could stand up to a high-level boardroom picking up discards. Curiosity had turned into an obsession. He had to know the answer to the question, why? The next morning, Instead of going straight to the office, he asked his driver to take him to an address in the Pilsen neighborhood. He sat in his sleek black Mercedes, the tinted windows making him feel completely out of place among the old brick buildings adorned with vibrant murals. At 6:30 a.m., he saw her. Ilara stepped off a bus, looking exhausted after an overnight shift. She wore a thin, frayed coat, her wool hat pulled low over her face against the biting Chicago wind. But she didn't head straight home. Alexander signaled his driver to keep a distance and follow. Ilara walked 2 blocks, then stopped in front of a modern, clean building called the Bridges Development Center. She walked inside and stayed for only about 15 minutes. When she emerged, her gait seemed slightly lighter, though the fatigue still etched her face. As soon as she left, Alexander called Julian. "Check out the Bridges Center in Pilsen for me." Less than 5 minutes later, Julian called back. "Sir, it's a specialized therapy facility for children with autism spectrum disorder and sensory processing disorder. The cost here is extremely high." Julian paused before continuing. "And according to information I just received from their accounting department, a colossal debt under the name Ilara Reed was paid in full this morning, by personal check." The phone nearly slipped from Alexander's hand. $150,000. The money from his arrogant wager. It wasn't used to buy a new car, a nicer apartment, or designer clothes. It was used to pay off medical debt. The question, why, now had part of an answer. But that answer opened up countless other questions. He ordered the driver to park around the corner, then stepped out himself. The cold air hit his face, a raw truth far removed from the filtered air of his building. He walked along the street where Ilara lived. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building with no elevator. The window overlooked a small alley. He didn't know what he was looking for. Perhaps he just wanted to see the world she lived in, the world that had forced a genius to give up everything, and then he saw her again. She was in the small communal courtyard behind the building with a little boy. The boy was about 6, with brown hair just like his mother, sitting on a long bench. What immediately caught Alexander's attention were the large noise-cancelling headphones the boy was wearing. He wasn't looking around or running. He was intently stacking colourful wooden blocks into a perfectly straight line on the bench. Ilara sat beside her son, but she was no longer the cold, aloof woman from the office. Her defensive wall was gone. She looked at the boy with a tenderness that made Alexander feel like an intruder. She said something, her voice soft, and the boy gently shook his head without looking up. It was a private world for the two of them, quiet and complete. Alexander felt he had to do or say something. He couldn't just stand there like a stalker. He put his hand in his coat pocket and, in a seemingly clumsy gesture, dropped his car keys onto the sidewalk. The sound of metal clattering on concrete was jarring. The boy flinched, covering his headphones with both hands. Ilara immediately turned, her eyes sharp as daggers when she saw him. The defensive wall instantly went up. "Mr. Vance?" Her voice was filled with caution. "What are you doing here?" Alexander bent down to pick up the keys, trying to appear as casual as possible. "Hello, Miss Reed. I was just taking a walk, needed some fresh air." It was a clumsy lie, and both of them knew it. Ilara's gaze swept over his expensive suit and polished leather shoes. A man like him would never just take a walk in a neighborhood like this. He glanced at the boy, who was still bowed over, trying to rearrange the blocks that had been knocked out of line. "This is my son," Ilara said, her voice clearly protective. "Leo." "Hello, Leo," Alexander said, but the boy didn't react. He was still immersed in his world of wooden blocks. An awkward silence descended. Alexander felt completely superfluous. He, a man who could command an entire boardroom, didn't know what to say to a woman and her young son. He looked at her, the mother patiently sitting beside her child, then looked back at their cramped apartment. He thought about the check, the medical debt, the career left behind. And for the first time, a genuine sense of guilt crept into his heart. His arrogance had turned into a game of chance with their lives, a game which, ironically, he had helped them win. "I need to take him inside," Ilara said, breaking the silence. "It's getting cold." She didn't invite him in, she simply announced the end of the encounter. She gently placed her hand on Leo's shoulder, and the boy began to methodically gather his blocks. Alexander could only nod. "All right, I'll see you at the office." He watched them walk into the building, the old door closing shut behind them. He stood alone on the unfamiliar street, clearly feeling the contrast between his glass tower and this small, resilient world. He had come here for answers, but now he only felt like he was part of the problem. Alexander didn't get back into his car right away. He stood there, lost in thought, until the cold seeped through his expensive coat. He couldn't just leave. Walking away now felt like an admission of defeat, as if he were running from the complex world he had just touched. He turned back toward the building, a vague intention forming in his mind. He would say something, anything, an apology, an offer. He didn't know. He only knew he couldn't let the meeting end in such awkwardness. Just then, the building door opened again. Ilara stepped out, carrying 2 large bags of trash. She clearly didn't expect him to still be there. She startled, her steps slightly faltering. "You haven't left yet?" she asked, her voice returning to its cautious tone. Alexander began, searching for a plausible reason. "I thought perhaps I should make sure you don't need any help." A faint, almost mocking smile crossed Ilara's lips. "I've been taking out my own trash for 28 years, Mr. Vance. I think I'll be fine." She walked past him, heading toward the large dumpsters at the end of the alley. Alexander felt foolish. He was about to turn away, but a sound from behind stopped him. It was a piercing scream. Not the whiny cry of a normal child. It was a sharp, desperate sound. Both of them turned back. The door to Ilara's apartment was ajar, and Leo was standing there. He had taken off his headphones. His eyes were wide and panicked, fixed on Alexander, the strange, large man still standing in front of his home. His prolonged presence had broken the fragile safety of Leo's world. "Oh no," Ilara whispered, dropping the trash bags and rushing toward her son. But it was too late. The panic attack had hit. Dry sobs erupted from the boy's throat. He covered his ears with both hands, but it didn't seem to be enough. He began to lightly hit his temples with his palms, a frantic, desperate rhythm in an attempt to shut out a world that was too loud, too overwhelming. He started backing into the apartment, stumbled, and collapsed onto the floor. "Leo, Mummy's here, my love." Ilara rushed in, kneeling down in front of her son, trying to shield him from Alexander's view. "It's okay. No one is here. Just you and me." But Leo couldn't hear. He was drowning in his own storm. Alexander stood frozen at the threshold. His first reaction was to leave. This was private, painful. He didn't belong here. But as he started to retreat, a searing memory flashed in his mind. Michael. His younger brother, Michael, who had died from a high fever at the age of 8. Michael had been like this too. Unexplained panic attacks, times when he would hurt himself just to stop a feeling no one understood. His parents had called it moodiness. They had tried to soothe him, hug him, even yell at him. Everything only made the situation worse. Alexander remembered the only thing that had worked. It was silence, a non-judgmental presence. Instead of leaving, he stepped into the apartment and gently closed the door. Ilara looked up, her eyes filled with astonishment and fury. "Go," she hissed, her voice a whisper. "You're scaring him." Alexander didn't answer. He didn't look at her or Leo. He just quietly walked to the farthest corner of the room where there was an old armchair. He didn't sit on the chair. He sat down on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, making himself as small as possible. He crossed his arms, bowed his head, and waited. He made himself part of the furniture, harmless, motionless. Ilara was stunned. She had prepared for pity, discomfort, or a clumsy offer of help, but she was not prepared for this quiet patience. She turned back to Leo. The storm was slowly subsiding. The tapping on his head slowed, then stopped. The piercing screams turned into quiet whimpers. The boy slowly lowered his hands, peeking around. He saw his mother, then he glanced toward the corner. He saw the strange man still there, but he wasn't looking at him. He was just sitting still, like a rock. The silence lingered. Gradually, Leo crawled to his basket of blocks and began arranging them again, seeking order in his chaotic world. Ilara let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She slowly stood up, her legs numb. She looked at the man sitting on her floor. The floor was dusty. His Tom Ford suit would surely be dirty. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." Alexander looked up. "Is he all right?" "He'll be fine," she replied. "He just needs time to reset." Silence descended again, but this time it was no longer suffocating. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. Ilara looked around her small, cluttered apartment, then back at the man who belonged to a completely different world. In a moment of impulse, she heard herself say, "I was about to cook spaghetti. Would you like to stay for dinner? Just as a thank you." Alexander looked at her, surprised. Then he nodded. "I'd like that very much." Dinner was strangely quiet. Only the clinking of forks and the faint hum of the old refrigerator could be heard. Spaghetti with jarred tomato sauce, sprinkled with a little powdered cheese. For Alexander, who was used to 5-star meals, this was probably the simplest meal he had ever had, and also the best meal he'd had in years. Leo sat at the table, but he ate in his own world, occasionally arranging the pieces of pasta on his plate into straight lines. After Leo finished eating and returned to his blocks, Ilara finally looked at Alexander. Her eyes no longer held defensiveness, only genuine curiosity. "Why did you care?" she asked directly. "A CEO shouldn't be sitting on a dusty floor like this." Alexander put down his fork. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time he was completely honest, not just with her, but with himself. "Perhaps because I just realized," he said slowly, "that my $150,000 was used for something meaningful for the first time." Alexander's confession hung in the small space between them, genuine and raw. Ilara looked at him, trying to find a hint of deceit or condescension in his eyes, but found none. Only a strange weariness and something akin to remorse. She cleared their plates, her movements slow and deliberate. "It wasn't your money," she gently corrected. "You lost a bet. I won it." The way she said it wasn't mocking, just a simple statement of fact. It subtly re-established the boundary between them. He was the loser, she was the winner. Everything was square. Alexander nodded, accepting the correction. "You're right. You won." He stayed a little longer, watching Ilara clean up and play with Leo. He didn't talk much, just observed. He saw how she communicated with her son, not with a barrage of questions, but with a quiet presence. He saw that their world was built on patience and unspoken rules, and he felt a deep admiration, a feeling he rarely extended to anyone. When he left, the atmosphere was less tense. "Thank you for dinner," he said at the door. "Thank you for staying," she replied, a quiet acknowledgement of his earlier actions with Leo. That night, on his way back to his luxurious penthouse, Alexander couldn't stop thinking. He had seen the answer to the question, why? It was Leo. Ilara had given up everything for her son. She had chosen a job that was less intellectually demanding, but gave her the time flexibility that no academic position could offer. But to Alexander, that was unacceptable. It was an irrational waste of talent. A mind like Ilara's could not be buried under layers of dust and cleaning chemicals. The next day, he acted. Vance Corp was preparing for a major merger with a Swiss multinational corporation. The deal was incredibly complex, involving legal documents in German, French, and Italian. It required someone who was not only skilled in languages, but also had the sharp analytical ability to find loopholes in the contracts. It was the perfect job for Ilara. He had a new job description drafted: Senior Language and Strategic Analysis Consultant. The salary was 6 times her waitress wage, with flexible hours and special benefits, including top-tier health insurance for the entire family. He thought he had considered everything. He was offering her a golden lifeline. 2 days later, he summoned her to his office. Ilara walked in, still in her grey uniform. She looked around the vast 90th floor office, with its panoramic view of the entire city, her eyes devoid of longing or envy, only caution. "Please sit down, Ms. Reed," Alexander said, his tone strictly professional. He pushed the job description across the desk. "I'd like you to look this over." Ilara took the paper. She read it carefully, line by line, word by word. Her brows furrowed slightly. When she finished, she placed it gently on the table. "What is this?" she asked, her voice calm. "It's a job offer," Alexander replied, trying to keep his voice from sounding too eager. "As you can see, the company is in desperate need of someone with your particular skill set. This position would report directly to me." He waited. He expected surprise, delight, perhaps a hint of gratitude. But Ilara only shook her head. "I can't accept it, sir." Alexander was stunned. "Can't? Why not? The salary, the benefits, the flexible hours." "I thought of Leo." "I know," Ilara said, and for the first time, Alexander saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, a deep weariness. "You thought of everything, except one thing." "What is that?" "My dignity," she replied, her voice not raised, but every word was a knife. "Mr. Vance, I clean floors for a living because it is honest work. The night shift allows me to have the entire day to take Leo to therapy. The pay is low, but it is mine, earned by me. I don't need a position created out of your pity." Anger began to flare up in Alexander. Pity. He was trying to save her from a dead-end life. "Pity," he shot back. "This is a real position. Your skills are real. Do you think I'd create a senior role in a multi-billion-dollar deal just out of charity for you?" "Wouldn't you?" Ilara stood up, facing him across the wide desk. "2 days ago, I was invisible to you. Now, after you stepped into my poor apartment and saw my disabled son, you suddenly create a dream job? Please don't insult my intelligence, sir." Her words struck straight at his ego. He was accustomed to using money and power to solve all problems. He had thought he was doing the right thing, the noble thing. But in her eyes, he was just a rich man trying to buy gratitude. The anger in him surged, but it was quickly quenched by another feeling: respect. She had refused. She had refused the money, the status, the easy way out, all for the sake of her self-respect. She would rather continue cleaning floors than accept what she perceived as charity. He looked at her, standing there, small in her oversized uniform, yet radiating a fierce strength greater than any man he had ever known. She hadn't broken. She had simply chosen to fly at a lower altitude to protect the most precious thing she had. And in that moment, between the anger and the admiration, Alexander realized a terrifying and undeniable truth. He was in love with her. He was in love with the resilience, the intelligence, and the unshakable self-respect of this woman, a hopeless, complicated love that would almost certainly never be returned. After Ilara's outright refusal, an invisible but solid wall was erected between them. 2 weeks passed in strained silence. Alexander no longer deliberately engineered accidental encounters. He only observed her from afar, through security camera footage or brief passing glances in the hallway. He saw her still performing her job with customary meticulousness, still quietly picking up discarded books. Her existence in his building was both a reminder of resilience and a torment for his unspoken feelings. He tried to push her out of his mind, focusing on the merger with the Swiss corporation. Things were progressing, except for one final obstacle: convincing Signor Lorenzo Rossi, a small but influential Italian minority partner, to sell his shares. Rossi was an old fox. He flew to Chicago, sat in Alexander's boardroom, and spent the entire afternoon playing cat and mouse. He spoke excellent English, but deliberately interspersed complex, archaic Italian phrases to confuse the Vance Corp legal team. As my father used to say, Rossi smirked, "Chi compra il sole non vuole l'ombra." He who buys the sun does not want the shadow. Alexander's interpreters translated mechanically, but they missed the deeper implication. Rossi was hinting that if Vance Corp wanted his company, they had to accept the hidden debts and unfavorable terms he was concealing. Alexander was starting to lose his patience. The room was suffocating with the impasse. Just then, the boardroom door gently opened. Ilara stepped in, holding a folder of documents. Alexander's assistant was sick today, and the mailroom had asked her, the only person they saw in the hallway, to deliver an urgent document for his signature. She intended to quietly place the folder on the side table and leave immediately, but Rossi's next comment made her stop. Seeing Alexander's exasperated expression, Rossi laughed with delight. "Ah, young Mr. Vance, forse la sua gatta ha fretta di fare I gattini. Perhaps your cat is in a hurry to have kittens." The interpreter stammered. "He says, perhaps your cat is in a hurry." The whole room was silent. It was clearly a taunt, but no one understood its precise meaning. Ilara, standing in the corner, gently drew a breath. She recognized the idiom. It was an ancient mocking way to imply that someone was losing their composure for no reason. She walked quickly and silently to Alexander's back. He felt her presence and turned, his eyes full of inquiry. She leaned close to his ear, her voice a quick, clear whisper. "It's an insult." "Answer him." "La mia gatta è paziente, signor Rossi, ma ha gli artigli affilati per I topi che giocano nel fienile." Alexander didn't need to ask for a repeat. He trusted her. He turned back to face Rossi, a cold smile on his lips. He spoke distinctly, though not in native Italian, yet with enough authority. "La mia gatta è paziente, signor Rossi," he repeated, "ma ha gli artigli affilati per I topi che giocano nel fienile." "My cat is patient, Mr. Rossi, but she has sharp claws for the mice playing in the barn." The smugness on Rossi's face froze, then vanished, replaced by utter astonishment. Alexander had not only understood, but retaliated with another, more potent idiom. Mice playing in the barn, a perfect metaphor for someone trying to hide something dirty. Rossi was silent for a long moment, then burst into hearty laughter. "All right, Mr. Vance. You win. Let's talk seriously." The negotiations were broken open. Half an hour later, Rossi left with a signed agreement. The room was filled with relief and excitement. Alexander's team congratulated him. As they filed out, only he and Ilara remained in the large boardroom. "How did you—" Alexander began, still slightly dazed. "My grandmother was from Sicily," she replied concisely, starting to retreat toward the door. "I need to get back to work." "Wait," Alexander said, stepping toward her. The adrenaline from the victory still surged through his veins. He looked at her, not as a waitress, but as an ally, a secret weapon. The admiration, gratitude, and long-suppressed feelings erupted all at once. He didn't think. He acted purely on instinct. He stepped forward, gently held her arm, and kissed her. It was a fleeting, impulsive, and emotional kiss. For a brief second, he felt the softness of her lips, the faint scent of lemon soap, and her rigid surprise. And then she pushed him away forcefully. The push wasn't physically strong, but it was like an icy wall. Ilara's eyes looked at him, no longer with caution, but with deep hurt and anger. "Don't you ever," she hissed, her voice trembling, "don't you ever do that again." She felt violated. He had used her intellect as a tool, and now he was rewarding her with a kiss, as if she were a trophy. To her, it was not a romantic gesture. It was a raw assertion of power. She turned and practically ran out of the room, leaving Alexander standing alone. The excitement of victory completely vanished, replaced by the bitter taste of regret. He had broken the wall between them, but not in the way he had hoped. He had destroyed it. He didn't know that the entire incident had been recorded. In the chairman of the board's office, Catherine Vance, Alexander's mother, was reviewing the security footage. She was a powerful woman, her platinum hair neatly pinned up, her demeanor radiating coldness and pragmatism. She had heard about the Waitress through gossip. She had seen her son's emotional distress over the past 2 weeks. She watched the scene of her son kissing a low-level employee right in the boardroom. She didn't see romance. She saw a potential scandal, a harassment lawsuit, a dangerous distraction for the CEO right before a historic merger. Her son had let emotion cloud his judgment. She would not. She picked up the phone and called the head of human resources. The waitress, Ilara Reed. Her voice was devoid of emotion. "Find a reason. Violation of the company's code of conduct. Inappropriate influence on senior management. Terminate her contract. Immediately. Ensure she receives a generous severance package and signs a non-disclosure agreement." She hung up. The problem was solved. Cleanly, quickly, and without Alexander needing to know. At least, not until it was too late. Immediately after the kiss, Alexander had to fly to Zurich to finalize the last procedures of the deal. The trip lasted 3 days, and they were the most agonizing days of his life. He had acted like a fool, a condescending jerk. He had crossed an unforgivable line. He tried to call her. Her phone number, which he had obtained from her HR file, rang endlessly before going to voicemail. He left a clumsy message. "Ilara, it's me. Alexander, I'm sorry about what happened. Please call me back." She never called back. When he returned to Chicago, the success of the deal seemed meaningless. The first thing he did, even before going home, was return to the office at 10 p.m. He knew it was her working hour. He walked down the hallway, his heart pounding, ready with a more sincere apology. But the person he saw, pushing the familiar cleaning cart, was not her. It was an older woman with an unfamiliar face. "Excuse me," Alexander asked, trying to hide his disappointment. "Where is Miss Reed?" The woman shrugged. "I don't know, I was just called in to cover the shift. Heard she quit." Quit. The 2 words hammered at his mind. Number. Ilara wouldn't quit. She needed this job. She needed stability for Leo. Maybe she just switched shifts. Or was sick. He reassured himself with logical explanations. The next morning, his patience ran out. He called the head of human resources directly. "I need information on Ilara Reed's employment status," he ordered. There was a hesitant silence on the other end. Mr. Vance, according to the records, Ms. Reed voluntarily resigned for personal reasons, effective immediately. Personal reasons? Nonsense, Alexander snarled. What did she say? When did she submit her resignation? All procedures were completed 3 days ago, sir. There is a confidentiality agreement signed, so I cannot provide further details. I'm very sorry. Confidentiality agreement for a cleaning staff member. Alarm bells screamed in Alexander's head. He knew the tone of a liar instructed to lie, and he knew only one person in this company had enough power to order the head of HR to conceal information from the CEO himself. His mother. A cold rage ran down his spine. He hung up without another word. He stormed out of his office, ignoring the surprised looks of his employees. He had no proof, but he knew exactly what had happened. His kiss, the security camera. His mother's iron hand had cleaned up his mess. He had to find her. He drove himself, the Bentley speeding down the highway toward the Pilsen neighborhood. He needed to explain. He needed to correct this mistake. He had caused this, and he had to make it right. He ran up the 3 flights of stairs of the old building, his breath ragged. He pounded on the door of her apartment. No answer. He knocked harder. "Ilara! It's me, Alexander! Open the door!" The door of the apartment across the hall opened. An elderly woman, wrapped in a shawl, looked at him with suspicion. "Who are you looking for?" "I'm looking for Miss Reed. Ilara Reed. Is she home?" The woman shook her head. "Oh, that poor girl. She moved out. Last week." "Moved out?" Alexander's heart sank. "Where did she go?" "Who knows?" the old woman said, her voice full of pity. "Heard she lost her job. Couldn't afford the rent anymore. Moved out in a hurry. Only saw her and the boy carrying a few bags." Every word the old woman spoke was like a hammer blow to his chest. Lost her job. Couldn't afford the rent. Moved out in a hurry. It was all his fault. His stupid, selfish kiss. He hadn't thought of the consequences, hadn't thought of the power imbalance, hadn't thought of how his actions could ruin her life. He had destroyed the fragile stability she had struggled to build for her son. The $150,000 had given her a fresh start, and in one careless moment, he had taken it all away. He stood frozen in front of the empty apartment door, guilt overwhelming him like a tidal wave. He hadn't just hurt her. He had driven her and her son onto the streets. He staggered down the stairs, out of the building. Outside, a cold rain began to fall, as if the Chicago sky was weeping for his foolishness. He didn't get into his car. He just stood there, under the increasingly heavy rain, letting the cold drops wash over his face. His thousands of dollars suit was soaked, but he felt nothing. The cold outside couldn't compare to the cold, empty void in his chest. He was consumed by remorse, a deep and bitter regret that made it difficult to breathe. He had been a powerful man, accustomed to getting everything he wanted. And now, he stood helpless in the rain, in front of an empty house, realizing that his arrogance had just ruined the only thing he had truly begun to care about. The rain that night didn't wash away Alexander's guilt. It only made him more sober. For the next 3 months, he became a ghost in his own company. He delegated almost all executive work to his vice presidents. His entire energy was focused on a single goal: finding Ilara. He mobilized Julian and a top-tier private investigation team. They turned the city upside down. They checked every rental record, every job application, every school with special programs. But it was useless. Ilara Reed had vanished, as if she had never existed. She didn't use credit cards, didn't register a new address. She was living completely off the grid, a skill only the most desperate people possess. The helplessness gnawed at Alexander. He realized that his money and power were useless against someone determined not to be found. He confronted his mother in a blazing row. She coldly admitted everything. I protected you and the company from a mistake. Be grateful for that. But Alexander didn't feel grateful. He only felt disgusted. Meanwhile, in another older neighborhood, Ilara was fighting for survival. Those 3 months were hell. She and Leo stayed in a small rented room that she paid for weekly. She worked 2 jobs simultaneously, cleaning for a small company at night and helping out at a laundromat in the morning. She only slept a few hours a day. The worst part was that she had to suspend Leo's intensive therapy sessions. She could no longer afford them. Every time she saw her son struggling with sensory overload without professional support, her heart was squeezed. Her pride had come at too high a cost. Then one day, a letter arrived. It wasn't sent to her address, but to the Bridges Center, which forwarded it to her. The letter was headed with the name of an organization she had never heard of, the Starlight Education Fund. Inside, the content stunned her. The letter formally announced that Leo Reed had been selected to receive a lifetime educational grant. The fund would cover the entire cost of all necessary therapy programs, special education, and medical care until he turned 18, unconditionally. Ilara read the letter over and over, her hands shaking. A miracle, but she didn't believe in miracles. In a city like Chicago, there were no anonymous angels, only people with their own agendas. The Starlight Education Fund. She looked it up online. It had just been established 2 weeks ago. The registration records were very secretive, but when she dug deeper, she found a name on the advisory board, a lawyer specializing in trusts. The same lawyer who had been present in the Vance Corporation boardroom that fateful night. And she knew. The anger she had been trying to suppress for 3 months erupted fiercely. It overwhelmed both her fatigue and despair. He dared to do this. After ruining her life, he thought he could use money to soothe his conscience, to turn himself into a silent savior. The next day, she took a bus to the city center. She walked into the Vance Corp building, no longer an invisible employee. She went straight to the reception desk, her hair pulled back, her eyes blazing. "I need to see Alexander Vance. Tell him Ilara Reed is here." She stormed past his new assistant, who was trying to stop her. She pushed open the door to his 90th floor office. Alexander was standing by the window, looking out at the city. He had lost weight. When he heard the door open, he turned, and when he saw her, a complex expression crossed his face. Shock, relief, and then preparation for a storm. He had been waiting for this moment. "The Starlight Education Fund," Ilara said, her voice hoarse with anger. She threw the letter onto his mahogany desk. "Do you think money can solve everything?" Alexander did not flinch from her gaze. He stepped toward her, but kept a safe distance. "No," he replied, his voice low and full of remorse. "Money can't solve anything between us." "Then what is this?" "Another act of charity. You destroy my life, then use your money to rebuild it the way you want. So you can sleep better? At night?" "Ilara, I looked for you," he said, his voice almost desperate. "I looked for you for 3 months. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to fix my mistake, but I couldn't find you. This was the only way I could think of." He took another step. "I know you would never accept money from me, but Leo is different. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of my mistake or because of your pride." That statement hit her most vulnerable spot. "Don't talk about my pride," she yelled, tears finally streaming down her face. "You don't know anything about the past 3 months. You don't know what it's like to watch your child suffer and be unable to do anything." "I do," he said softly, and the pain in his voice stunned her. "I do. And it's my fault. All of it is my fault." He paused, taking a deep breath, looking straight into her eyes. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not asking for your gratitude. I'm only begging you for one thing." He stepped closer, his voice almost a plea. "No, money doesn't fix my mistake, but it can protect Leo while I find a way to atone for what I did to you. Please, don't let pride take away his chance." His words collapsed her last defensive wall. She hated him. She hated his arrogance, hated the way he used money to manipulate the world. But she couldn't hate the truth in his words. This was for Leo. It was always for Leo. She stood there, tears rolling down her cheeks, an intense internal battle raging. Finally, she let out a shaky breath, a weary surrender. "I'm doing this for him," she said, her voice barely audible. "Only for him." She wiped her tears, regaining her hardened exterior, even though she was shattered inside. "Don't ever look for me again." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Alexander alone with a fragile ray of hope. She had accepted the help. The door was not completely slammed shut, and for him right now, that was enough. Alexander kept his word. He didn't look for her again. A year passed. For Ilara, it was a year of rebirth. Free from the burden of debt, she was able to move into a better apartment near a quiet park. She found a part-time job at the university library. A job that didn't pay much, but nourished her soul. Most importantly, Leo had made remarkable progress. With regular therapy, the boy began to communicate in short sentences. His panic attacks became less frequent, and sometimes he even smiled at strangers. Every small step forward for her son was proof that her decision to set aside her pride was the right one. For Alexander, it was a year of change. He ran Vance Corp with a new vision. He realized that legacy was not just numbers on a balance sheet. Inspired by the woman who had translated an ancient will with nothing but her intellect, he did something no one in the business world expected. He established the Vance Linguistic and Heritage Fund, a non-profit branch of the corporation dedicated to funding the research and preservation of ancient languages and endangered cultural heritage. It was his way of atoning. He couldn't fix the past, but he could build a future where talents like Ilara's would never be left behind. And then, the fund needed a director, someone with deep expertise, vision, and genuine passion. Instead of appointing someone from his familiar academic circles, Alexander organized a public, transparent recruitment process. He hired a top headhunting firm, setting stringent requirements. He knew it was a gamble, but it was the only way to do this correctly. 2 weeks later, the headhunter called him. "We found a near-perfect candidate." A very interesting profile. Miss Reed was a brilliant scholar at Yale, disappeared for a while, but has recently begun publishing small research articles in online journals again. She is exactly who we need. Alexander's heart pounded, but he kept his voice completely calm. "Good. Send her a formal interview invitation, like every other candidate." When Ilara received the email, she thought it was a mistake. But when she read it carefully, she saw it was entirely professional. The invitation came from a reputable recruiting firm for a position that seemed tailor-made for her. There was no trace of Alexander Vance. She hesitated for a week, going back to that building, facing him again. But then she looked at Leo, coloring peacefully. She looked at the stacks of research books she had started reading again. This wasn't charity. This was an opportunity. An opportunity she had earned with her own talent. She would go there, not as a floor cleaner or a single mother in need of assistance, but as E. Reed, a linguist. On the day of the interview, she walked into the Vance Corporation building. This time, she entered through the main doors. She wore a simple but elegant business outfit. Her hair was neatly tied back, revealing her intelligent forehead. She no longer had the look of fatigue or defensiveness. She was confident and radiant. She walked into the boardroom. Alexander sat at the head of the table, but he wasn't alone. Next to him were two vice presidents and the head of human resources. It was a real interview panel. He looked at her, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He saw the change. He saw the person she was meant to be. His eyes no longer held pity or guilt, only deep respect. The interview proceeded professionally. They asked her about her vision, about her plans for the fund's development. She answered intelligently, sharply, and passionately. She didn't just answer questions, she painted a future for the organization that they hadn't even conceived of. At the end of the interview, the other panel members nodded in approval. They left the room for a private discussion. Only Alexander and Ilara remained. He stood up, walked toward her, and extended his hand. Not for a kiss, but for a handshake. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Reed." She took his hand. Their handshake was firm and equal. A moment later, the entire panel returned. The vice president smiled. "Welcome to Vance Corp, Director." Ilara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. She looked at Alexander, and in her eyes there was no longer anger, only a mutual understanding. That afternoon, Alexander cleared his desk, loosening his tie. He walked out of the elevator, passing through the vast main lobby. He saw them near the revolving glass doors. Ilara was sitting on a bench, and Leo was standing next to her, pointing excitedly at an architectural model in a display case, saying something with enthusiasm. The boy was no longer wearing his noise-cancelling headphones. A warm feeling swelled in Alexander's heart. He took a deep breath, then walked toward them. He was no longer the powerful CEO bestowing favors, nor the sinner trying to atone. He was just a man leaving work, hoping to walk home with his family. Ilara looked up as he approached, a slight smile on her lips. "Finally," she said softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You've learned how to listen." Alexander smiled back, the most sincere smile he had ever had. "I'm still learning." Leo turned around, looking at him with curiosity instead of fear. Alexander sat down at the boy's eye level. "Hello, Leo. Would you like me to show you the real golden falcon?" Leo nodded. The soft evening light streamed through the colossal glass windows, enveloping the three of them. Alexander stood up, walking beside Ilara, while Leo happily walked between them. They walked together through the revolving door, leaving the glass tower, the symbol of power and solitude, and stepped out into the world outside, together. A new beginning, a perfect translation for their future. And so, the journey of Alexander, Ilara, and little Leo reached a new beginning. Not with a rushed fairy tale ending, but with a handshake of equality. Their story reminds us that sometimes the biggest walls are not built with brick and stone, but with arrogance and invisible prejudices. This story is not just about a wealthy CEO and a wise waitress. More profoundly, it is a lesson in translating a person. Alexander initially only saw the uniform, but he eventually learned how to read the dignity and resilience within Ilara. Conversely, Ilara also looked past Alexander's arrogance to see a man eager to correct his mistakes and capable of change. They taught us that true power lies not in commanding, but in listening. True value lies not in the amount of money you have, but in the integrity you maintain. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the most genuine connection does not come from charity, but from mutual understanding. It is not built with money, but with respect, cultivated over time. To see the hidden gem, sometimes we must be willing to sit down on the dusty floor and wait patiently. And I also want to ask you one thing, after going through this story together. In your own life, have you ever felt your value was obscured, or have you ever seen a hidden talent in an unexpected place? Please share your feelings, because every story deserves to be heard. Thank you for accompanying me. I hope this story leaves a little warmth and reflection in your heart. See you on the next journey.